Hey everyone, welcome to the video. I'm your host Brisket, and today I'm excited to present my interpretation of Aimer7's guide, A Heuristic for Geometric Positioning. In this video, I'll go through the document and summarize the info, hopefully making it easier to understand. I'll also show some in-game footage of the concepts we discuss. I'll put some links to this document, as well as links to all of my references and my socials in the description box below. Another note, I'm making these videos as part of my personal journey to improve and continue learning about gaming. If you want to take your knowledge to a deeper level, I encourage you to check out the source materials, as much of the information I'll present to you today is distilled, and I have chosen to omit certain topics in the guide in an effort to make the subject matter more digestible. If you have any feedback, please make sure to leave a comment on the video. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Alright, so first things first, let's lay some ground rules about what we're specifically going to be discussing today. In shooters, esports titles, and competitive games in general, there are two parts to your gameplay, macro and micro. The difference is the time scale that these areas apply to. Macro is geared towards the big picture throughout the entire match, things like economy, loadout, rotation timings, etc. Micro focuses on optimizing the moment-to-moment interactions and mechanics, such as aiming and movement. Positioning is one of the few fundamentals that can fall into both categories. In this guide, we're going to be focusing on micro positioning, where to stand and how to play different types of cover correctly. But we'll definitely cover macro positioning in Apex Legends in a future video. The fundamentals of micro, or geometric positioning, are universal in FPS games. Having a framework for how to approach certain scenarios will help you arrive at the correct conclusions to different problems you will encounter when playing the game. Now, before we get into the scenarios, I want to point out that there are three concepts that can alter or enhance the scenarios we'll be discussing, and they are as follows. The first is angle advantage. We won't go super in depth with this because there are plenty of videos already discussing this. I'll link one I like in the description below. The TLDR is that when two players are peeking each other around an obstacle, the person who's farther away from the obstacle has the advantage because they'll see their opponent first. If you're peeking from close, it's in your best interest to do so fast, and you better have a solid reason for doing so. The second are head glitches and a sort of cover rock paper scissors that can occur in FPS games. In case you aren't familiar with head glitches, all it means is standing behind cover in a way that only leaves your head exposed, making it much harder for your opponent to hit shots on you. There are three basic types of cover that you can head glitch on. High ground. You can use this to head glitch enemies behind short cover and on the low ground. Tall cover. You can use this to head glitch enemies on the high ground while staying protected from the ground level. And short cover, which you can use to head glitch people behind tall cover or moving through lanes and open spaces in the map. The final thing to keep in mind is that all sorts of utility, character abilities, and movement tech in Apex can affect how these types of cover can be attacked or played. This is where the nuance and creativity comes in. We'll go in depth on this in future videos as well. Got it? Perfect. Now, let's take one more step and define two important terms before I give you the framework. First is range of motion. What this means is the distance you or an opponent can travel in a direction in any given amount of time. You can imagine this range of motion as a bubble around your opponent's character model. For the sake of our examples, we won't consider how utility, movement abilities, or movement tech affect this distance. We'll save that for another video again. But please be aware that this bubble's shape and range can drastically change in real time, depending on what abilities or utility you or your opponent have at your disposal. Also keep in mind that the terrain and the objects around you and your opponent can limit or enhance the bubble's range as well. We'll see this in action when we cover the scenarios. The second term we need to define is hitbox. Hitboxes can mean different things in different games, but for the video today, we'll define it as the areas of your opponents that you can deal damage to. In Apex Legends and most FPS games, the hitboxes correlate very closely to the character model, but be aware they do not always line up exactly. Alright, so now for the framework. The rule of thumb is as follows. In general, when attacking an enemy, you should take an angle that maximizes the visible portion of your opponent's hitbox while minimizing their range of motion. Simultaneously, you want to minimize the visible portion of your hitbox while maximizing your range of motion. Sounds simple, right? Well, that's because it is a simple concept. However, the execution of this is a lot trickier in the heat of battle. Let's dive into some practical examples to see how we can apply this. The first scenario we'll discuss is the infinite wall. You can think of the scenario as the building block that will help you truly understand how to manipulate your opponent's range of motion. In this scenario, we are attacking an opponent who has their back against a wall that extends infinitely to their left and right. There are no obstacles between you and the opponent. Let's look at how this scenario appears in game. Alright, taking into account the framework we established in the first half of the video, let's ask ourselves the question, what's more important here? Minimizing your opponent's range of motion or maximizing their hitbox? Feel free to pause the video and consider this for a few moments. The answer in this case is minimizing the opponent's range of motion. In this case, there really isn't a meaningful way to maximize their hitbox because there are no obstacles between you. Controlling their range of motion will yield the maximum advantage. With this in mind, pause the video again and answer the following question. If the angle when we're looking at our opponent straight on is 0 degrees, at what angle would you want to stand in order to minimize your opponent's range of motion while maximizing your own range of motion? Let's break this down. One answer would be 90 degrees or minus 90 degrees, but this isn't optimal because it would put you in an even scenario with your opponent. Both of your AD strafe or left-right inputs potential is limited to one direction, and your forward and backwards movements would give each other free hits, as you wouldn't have to move your crosshairs to track in those directions. The optimal answer would be something like 60 degrees or minus 60 degrees. At this angle, you still maintain a full AD strafe potential while your opponent can only move in one predictable horizontal direction, like so. Furthermore, if they move forwards or backwards, the amount of horizontal tracking you have to do is vastly reduced. Now that we understand how to play against an opponent with their back to a wall, let's flip the script and say we have our back to the wall. The answer is explode off of the wall and away from our opponent with great speed. This restores our range of motion to its maximum at the risk of taking some free shots. And if the opponent doesn't mirror us, they will be forced back to the wall. As you can see, controlling the range of motion is all about putting ourselves in a spot where we can easily predict where our opponent will move by understanding where they can move. In the next scenario, we've pushed into a building and we've got our opponent backed into a corner. Let's ask the question again. Is it more important to minimize our opponent's range of motion or maximize their hitbox? The answer, again, is minimize their range of motion while maintaining our range of motion as free as possible. Now, again, assuming that the angle facing our opponent head-on is 0 degrees, which angles would be optimal to take? In this scenario, if we stand at 45 or minus 45 degrees, we end up against the wall, which again isn't optimal because our range of motion is limited and the situation becomes symmetrical. To take the optimal angle, we'd want to stand at about 20 degrees or minus 20 degrees. These angles only give the opponent two free strafe directions on the opposite side that you stand, left and forward left or right and forward right. Another good spot is standing straight on from your opponent at 0 degrees. This only gives them 3 forward directions, which are very easy to hit. This is a pretty scuffed spot for your opponent. In general, try not to stand in corners unless you have a solid reason to, but if you find yourself there, the best way to proceed is to explode out in any free direction you have and try and turn the tables. Our next scenario puts us in a position where we must attack an opponent who is hiding or peek shooting behind a corner. How do we tackle this? Let's consider different approaches. First, we could approach the enemy head-on, walking along the wall like so. While this could work if we're being completely quiet, the enemy could peek at any moment, and in that case our range of motion would be very limited, much like in the infinite wall scenario. A slightly better option would be taking a very wide angle like this. This is alright because it's turning the scenario into 2 infinite walls, but it does give the opponent more options to make it even. They even have an opportunity to swing around the corner and face you like this, or back away from the corner and free their range of motion completely. The safest option is to approach the enemy at an angle like this. If the wall is 0 degrees, we'd want to be 45 degrees from the wall. This has the benefit of keeping our range of motion free, making it so each time they peek us, they have to adjust their aim, while we can keep pre-aiming the same spot, utilizing angle advantage to catch our opponent exposing too much of their hitbox. As you advance and get near the corner, you can steal it from them and become the person peeking and baiting around the corner. This scenario finds us attacking an enemy behind an obstacle that we can see both sides of, like a big rock or vehicle or something along those lines. For the most part, you can treat this just like the previous scenario. Just make sure to keep tabs on the other side of the obstacle as you approach. Keep in mind, you want to stay further away from the rock than the enemy. You can bait the enemy by circling the obstacle, and you can also climb the obstacle, but this turns it into a different scenario that we'll cover later on. This one, again, is all about minimizing and predicting range of motion. Our next scenario covers how to deal with an opponent holding an opening. Quick disclaimer though, doors in Apex Legends have quite a bit of nuance to them, so we'll save that again for another video. Now, let's just focus on openings with no doors. In this scenario, minimizing the opponent's range of motion isn't optimal because the angles that accomplish this put you next to the wall, severely limiting your own range of motion. The optimal way to play this situation is to stay as far away as you can from the opening while aiming at the center, making sure to stand at a 45-degree angle, assuming standing straight on in front of the opening is 0 degrees. Slowly minimize the angle to get a visual on your opponent, and if they start pushing out or peeking, increase the angle to get cover. If you have to push into the opening, you want to approach at a wide angle and quickly get next to the wall, then explode through the opening as fast as possible, preferably with some tangible advantage like utility or a shield crack. Alright, so this brings us to our final scenario. If you remember earlier, I mentioned that climbing on top of the obstacles turned it into a different scenario. It turns out it becomes a high ground scenario. In this scenario, the high ground is the obstacle. In this case, you can assume that unless the enemy has a pretty good reason to push you, they won't drop from the high ground, because this would give up their advantageous position. We can use this knowledge to our advantage. Let's imagine first, we're on the high ground. The optimal way to play this would be to stand back from the edge, minimizing our hitbox by head glitching. As the enemy pushes closer or farther, we can increase or decrease the distance from the ledge to maintain the head glitch. Pretty freaking strong. What can the enemy do? In this case, with no tall cover, their best option is to push all the way to the base of the height and take an angle to the left or right. This is dangerous for the person on height because it greatly minimizes their range of motion if they want to peek, putting them at great risk of falling if they AD strafe next to the ledge. This works for all levels of height. In conclusion, I do want to mention that situations in game are rarely this sterile, and usually several types of cover are at play in a given situation, especially in a big map battle royale like Apex Legends. Another consideration is that while these scenarios are 1v1, this is rarely the case in team games, and it gets even more complicated when you consider third-party attacks. Take this knowledge and play around in the range, and pay attention in-game to see if you can identify different power positions, or how different arrangements of obstacles can change the way these scenarios play out. Thank you everyone for watching. Don't forget to like the subscribe button and smash the windows on the way out. And definitely stay tuned for the next one. Peace and blessings.